Hello, everybody. My name is Phyllis Stiles, Executive Director of Bee City USA. Welcome to today's webinar, The Plant Pollinator Connection, Why Pollinators Need Native Plants. This webinar is offered live to all Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA affiliates across the country. To date, we have certified 59 cities and counties in 24 states and 31 institutions of higher education in 18 states. We are in absolute awe of what each affiliate is doing locally to welcome pollinators into their communities in order to reverse pollinator decline. It's my privilege to introduce today's webinar leader, Bee City USA Science Advisory Board member, Dr. Doug Tallamy. Doug is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 87 research publications and has taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, humans and nature, insect ecology, and other courses for 34 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published by Timber Press in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. Among his many awards are the Garden Club of America Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation and the Tom Dodd Jr. Award of Excellence. If you haven't yet seen the documentary about Doug's work, Hometown Habitats, Stories of Bringing Nature Home, we urge you to check it out and consider airing it in your community. Today's formal program will last 1 hour, followed by Q&A, so please write your questions in the question section on your screen, and Dr. Tallamy will do his best to answer each of them after the formal presentation ends. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available. We invite you to gather your volunteers and staff together to watch and discuss it in the future. With that, Dr. Tallamy, the screen is yours.
Phyllis, can you, all right, there we go, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in. I want to talk about how plants and pollinators connect today. And I want to start by trying to get the next slide to go. How do we move the next slide here? There we go. All right, we're rolling now. This is E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, one of the most famous biologists of all time, certainly the most famous entomologist on the planet today. Two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, extremely educated, famous man. I've had the pleasure of meeting E.O. Wilson twice. Once was in 1982. We had a small conference on social insects. Of course, he's the world's leading myrmecologist, ant specialist. So he was there, a featured speaker. This was in Boulder, Colorado, and what we had were talks in the morning. Then there was a break, and because it was such a small conference, people just went outside and milled around. And I went out, and here's E.O. Wilson sitting on the curb, and nobody was sitting next to him. So I very uncharacteristically went over and sat next to him. And he turned and looked at me and he said, "Hi, I'm Ed Wilson. I don't believe we met." And I said, "Well, I'm Doug Tallamy." We shook hands and we talked for a while. Then the break was over. There were more talks. We had lunch, then more talks, then another break in the afternoon. Well, now E.O. and I were good buddies. So I went outside and here he is sitting on the curb. Nobody's sitting next to him. So I went and sat down next to him and he turned and looked at me and he said, "Hi, I'm Ed Wilson. I don't believe we met." So that was my first encounter with E.O. I did meet him 32 years later. He was being given the Ben Franklin Award in Philadelphia. I met Ben Franklin as well. But he was being awarded for a lifetime of excellence in science, particularly for his efforts to save biodiversity on this planet, literally to save life on Earth. He's been trying to do that for decades. One of the first things he wrote to try to stimulate conservation of life was this paper. It was the first paper published in Conservation Biology in 1987, called The Little Things That Run the World. And he was talking about conserving invertebrates. but essentially he's talking about conserving insects. And he said lots of things in this paper, but one of the group of things he focused on were what would happen if insects were to disappear from the planet. None of it would be good. If insects disappeared, of course, that would take our pollinators with us, and all the flowering plants would go extinct as well, or certainly most of them. If we lost our flowering plants, the physical structure of our terrestrial habitats would change drastically. Energy flow through our ecosystems would be highly altered, and food webs would collapse. That would mean that we would lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. And of course, that is just about everything. The biosphere would also start to rot because we would lose insect decomposers, which play major roles in turning plant biomass into nutrients that then cycle again. Of course, the most important thing he said is that humans would disappear as well. Humanity would be doomed. It was a very somber message, but it was largely ignored. If we humans depend on insects, why do we have National Insect Killing Week? Now, I know this was 1929, but let's face it, we have National Insect Killing Day every day. The spring rolls around, and as soon as I turn on the radio, I hear, insects are here, hire me, and I will kill them all. We don't seem to differentiate between any good insects or bad insects. We just want to kill them all. We haven't worried about this. Even people who like insects haven't worried about this because there's this feeling that insects are always here, they're always present, and they're certainly doing well in our natural areas. There are two reasons why this is no longer true today. I mean, it used to be true, but it's no longer true today. The first one is we don't have enough natural areas anymore. We have turned the planet into our mega cities, and they certainly were not designed to support insects, into our suburbs, and they were not designed to support insects. Even our exurban plots, the places people call going to the country, are largely not designed to support insects. We have agriculture spreading across the world. We have 770 million acres of rangeland in the U.S. That's 128 times larger than New Hampshire. So we're talking about a lot of area here. And it is not designed to support insects. As a matter of fact, food production on this planet now claims half of the Earth's land surface. And of course, we do everything we can to kill insects wherever we're growing food. Now, the second reason that insects are not doing well on the planet, particularly in our natural areas, is that we have fragmented those natural areas into to the point where they are too isolated and too small, and they are now almost universally invaded with plants from someplace else. And not just any old plant, these are very aggressive species that are displacing native plant communities, and we call them invasive species. And what you're looking at is a perfect example of the extent to which our natural areas are now invaded with plants, in this country largely from China. This is a little park. I drive by it on the way to work at the University of Delaware. It's called White Clay Creek State Park, and in the spring, plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. So what you're looking at is a series of plants from Asia that are all green, whereas none of our native plants have leafed out yet. All of our favorites are here. We've got multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and miscanthus and Norway maple and ailanthus and barberry and burning bush and on and on. And you may recognize all of those as being escapees from our garden. So now, particularly in the east here, in a typical natural habitat, about a third of the vegetation is from Asia. The problem with that, of course, is that those plants do not have the ability to support the insect life that we need here in North America, and we'll expand on that in a few minutes. So we're winning this war on insects, even though it's an undeclared war. We have not been measuring the extent to which we're winning it, but we're just starting to do that. There's two things have happened that have alerted people to the fact that insects are not doing so well. One is the decline of the honeybee, and of course we understand we need pollination, so people are reacting to that, and also the decline of the monarch. Those are two things that have gotten our attention. So we're starting to measure things now. Bumblebees are fairly easy to measure, so people have been doing that. And other native bees, 50% of our Midwestern native bees have disappeared from their historical range just in the last century. There are 4 species of bumblebees that have declined 96% in the last 20 years. 96%, they're essentially gone. 3 species have already, they're already extinct, and 25% of our bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. In Europe, things are no better. 30% of Europe's orthopterans, the grasshoppers and katydids and crickets in Europe are facing extinction, a full 30% of them. The Germans have done a better job of measuring things. There are now 5.3-fold fewer insects in Germany than there were in 1989. 46 species of moths and butterflies have already disappeared from Germany. And if you look at invertebrate abundance, insect abundance all over the globe, it has declined 45% since 1974. So none of these are very, very happy numbers. Of course, if we're losing insects, the things that depend on those insects, the things that eat insects, are also going to be in trouble. Again, we have not done a good job in measuring what's happening to insectivores. We do measure what's happening to birds, and those, of course, are primary insectivores. We have something called the State of the Birds Report. So many people like birds that it's now organized. We measure the state of the birds every year. In 2014, the State of the Birds Report came out and said there were 230 species of North American birds that were threatened with extinction. Well, just 2 years later, that number is now 432 species of North American birds. More than a third of our North American birds are now threatened with extinction. We have 1.5 billion fewer breeding birds today than we had just 40 years ago. And let me remind you, 1 billion is 1,000 million. There are a lot of birds that are not out there anymore. And you know, for the most part, we don't recognize this. It's a phenomenon called the shifting baseline phenomenon. If you don't remember what it used to be like, you don't recognize that it's no longer that way. So most of the people in the USA never knew a day when we had healthy biodiversity, so they don't miss it. Well, if insects are running the world, we have to turn this around. We have to generate the insects that run our ecosystems. So, you know, we're scratching our heads. How can we do that? I'd like to simplify the goal by having everybody focus on the property they own. If you look at just east of the Mississippi, 85.6% of the U.S. is privately owned. So now you don't have to worry about biodiversity everywhere. Just worry about it where you live. And of course, most of us live in places on properties that have not been designed to support the insects that we need. But if we all improve the ecological integrity of our own properties, we'd be 85.6% done, and that certainly is good news. Then we can worry about those public properties. A wildlife manager in England recently said that land ownership is more than a privilege, it's a responsibility. And I've been trying to put that into words for some time now. I think he's right on. There is a thin sphere of life, the zone of life that covers the earth. It's called the biosphere. And what we humans have done is chopped it up and say, well, you own this part, you own that part. This, as far as we know, is the only living part of our universe. And we're assigning it to people to manage. So I truly believe it is our responsibility to keep life going on these little pieces of that biosphere that we claim ownership of. If we're going to own land, we have to treat it responsibly. Not just because we want other life forms around, but because those life forms are keeping us here. So what we have to do, we have to look at landscapes like this, and we have to raise the bar about what we ask those landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to be pretty. We're good at that. We can make pretty landscapes. But today, we have to do lots of things at home that we didn't used to do. We have to design landscapes that support life. Because again, it is the life around us that are running the ecosystems that support us. If we lose life, we're not going to be in good shape. We have to design landscapes that sequester carbon. Too much carbon in the atmosphere. How do we get it out? We've got to plant the plants that are pulling it out and pumping it into the ground. So we're going to enrich our soil with carbon. We have to design landscapes that manage water, that manage our watersheds. Again, it's plants that do that. Most of us haven't thought about that when we're designing our landscapes, but we have to start now. And of course, we have to design landscapes that support pollinators. I'm going to talk a little bit about pollinators. It's politically correct now to support pollinators, or at least it was last year. So when we go to the nursery, what we've done in the past is simply to pick pretty plants because we've thought plants are only decorations. So they could be decorative, they could be screens, anchor, or focal points, but this seesaw is all balanced or slanted towards aesthetics. We have not thought about the ecological role that these plants have to play at home. But we could find pretty plants that do have food web value, that are supporting our pollinators, that are restoring our soil, that are sequestering carbon, that are helping our watersheds, that are maintaining a robust community of natural enemies. We can do all of that at once at home. So let's talk a little bit more about why we need to do this. Why do we need other species on this planet? In other words, why do we need biodiversity? Quite simply, it's biodiversity that, again, runs our ecosystems, that produce the ecosystem services that keep us alive on this planet. We ought to call them biodiversity services, because without the plants and animals running our ecosystems, we would not have what keeps us around. There was a very large study conducted between 2000 and 2005 by, I think, 160 scientists from around the world. Their goal was to measure the planet's ability to produce the ecosystem services that support humans. And after 5 years of studying it, they published it in something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. You can go online and read it. It's a huge document. But their unhappy conclusion is that as of 2005, we had already degraded the planet's ability to support us by 60%. What you're looking at is the ocean right there. That's not a recycling plant. And that poor guy is going out to fish. So that's the same as taking planet Earth and shrinking it by 60%. And we're doing that at the same time we are rapidly expanding our population. We now have, what, 7.3 billion humans on the planet. Each day we take more and more from planet Earth while we ruin the ecosystems that support us. So almost anybody can see that that is not a sustainable relationship. We have to turn that around. We have to regrow planet Earth. And we can do this by increasing the carrying capacity of the planet. What we have to do is very simply put the plants back, the plants that run those ecosystems, that create the species that run those ecosystems. So we're not talking about good land stewardship here. We are talking about essential land stewardship. We absolutely have to do this if we want to go into the future. The point here is that if we design landscapes that make insects, that is the best way to restore biodiversity, because insects are vital links to almost all of the food webs on this planet. Certainly the terrestrial food webs. It starts with those pollinators that keep the plants around, and then there's all the insects that eat plants that then pass on the energy to the animals that eat insects. So let's talk about how we make insects. What does it take to make an insect? Well, just like anything else, it takes energy, and that energy is coming from the sun. If we're looking for something we want to call a miracle on this planet, I would nominate photosynthesis. It is certainly a miraculous chemical reaction that allows us and everything else to eat sunlight. Sunlight, of course, hits plants. They take the energy from that sun, combine it with carbon dioxide from the air, water from the ground. It produces the oxygen we all still need. But equally important, that energy is now locked up in the carbon bonds of simple sugars and carbohydrates. In other words, food. That is the food that is driving food webs. And of course, the more plants you have, the more energy you're producing, the more food you're producing, so the more animals you have. So if we're going to make insects, first we need to make plants. Now, plants support insects in several different ways. If we're talking about pollinators, the majority of the food that the pollinators need, of course, are pollen and nectar. Plants are supporting them that way. There are a number of insects that eat dead wood, eat xylem. A lot of insects eat dead plant parts. We call them detritivores. They can eat those dead parts dead plant parts either when they're on the ground, that would be terrestrial detritus, or after those plant parts have fallen into water, into our swamps and rivers and streams. That's submerged detritus, and that supports our aquatic insects. But then most insects, of course, are eating living plants. They're eating the leaves, they're eating the roots, they actually eat the shoots and the stems and the seeds. All parts of plants are consumed by insects. So, of course, our pollinators, just to give you a few examples of each one of these guilds, includes all of the things that visit flowers and move pollen from female parts to male parts, or male parts to female parts. Insects that eat standing wood include many of our beetles, like the elderberry beetle here that tunnels into elderberry stems. These are longhorn beetles, very important wood-boring beetles. Also, metallic wood-boring beetles are buprestids, are important wood borers. Insects that eat fallen wood include our click beetles. These are just common insects we see every day. So now you can know where they come from. A number of our scarab beetles develop in dead and decaying wood. There's a family of beetles called the Passalidae, the best beetles, best bugs, that actually have advanced social behavior. The parents rear their young and they talk to them by stridulation, and then the young help the parents rear more young, very much like wasps. And they all live in rotting wood. Lots of insects eat leaves, and they do it in two different ways. They have chewing mouth parts like our caterpillars, like our grasshoppers and our katydids, our crickets, our other orthopterans. A number of beetles have chewing mouthparts that eat leaves. This is a chrysomelid beetle, a leaf beetle. Very large family of beetles, about 35,000 species of chrysomelids. Then we have lots of insects that have sucking mouthparts, and they're sucking juices out of plants, either the parenchymal juices of the green cells you see there, or they plug directly into the xylem or the phloem of plants. So things like leafhoppers and plant hoppers and cicadas, aphids, all of those guys. Lots of insects eat roots, but of course we don't see them. And one of the major group of root eaters are weevils. They're eating the roots as larvae. The adults will come above ground, but they typically eat our leaves at night, so we often don't see them. Even though weevils, it's the single largest family of multicellular organisms in the world, over 40,000 species of weevils. But there are other insects that eat roots. More scarab beetles eat roots. Things like our June beetles and Japanese beetles are root eaters. They form those big C-shaped grubs that Mr. Bluebeard here likes very much. Then we've got those insects that are eating detritus. We ignore these because we don't see them very much, but there are a lot of detritivores out there. Certainly crickets, a bunch of beetles like darkling beetles, the tenebrionids, are eating detritus. Things like our camel crickets, sometimes you run into these at night or in your basement. There are 70 species of moths in North America that eat detritus, eat dead leaves, like the spotted palthus or the American idita. These are often, we see these moths, but we don't realize that they developed on dead leaves, not on living leaves. Then we have thousands of species of flies, where the book will tell you they breed in decaying vegetation. These are major groups that are helping to break down that vegetation so the nutrients are released and plants can grow again. When we move into aquatic systems, there are lots of insects that are eating that aquatic detritus. Either directly or indirectly. That includes our mayflies and our caddisflies, our stoneflies, things like crane flies, tupulid larvae. A lot of people think these are giant mosquitoes because they look just like mosquitoes, but they actually have no mouth parts. Nobody's ever been bitten by a crane fly. And they are important components of our food webs. And midges, chironomid midges, these develop by the billions in swampy areas with very low levels of oxygen, eating that decaying vegetation in swamps. So often when you see a cloud of what looks like mosquitoes, people say, "Oh, it's mosquitoes coming to get it." These are midges that again have no mouth parts. They can't bite you, but they are important components of food webs. Now, if we're making insects that eat plants, we're also making the insects that eat insects. We're making insect predators. This is a horsefly. But as a larva, it's an aquatic predator, eats other types of insects in the water. We have acilids. These are robber flies that eat. They're called the sharks of the insect world. Eat lots of types of insects. Our dragonflies and many other types of predators are out there, and they are important components of food webs. Then, of course, we have spiders. Now, spiders are not insects. They have 8 legs instead of 6, but they're extremely important competitors. They're predators. And if we lost our spiders, the balance between insects and other forms of the ecosystem would be tipped. So we call these guilds of insects. They're all doing the same things, even though they have different taxonomic origins. They are all necessary to run our ecosystems, but they do not contribute to food webs equally, meaning they are not passing food to other animals, particularly vertebrates, equally. Some insects do that a lot more than others. Let's talk briefly about how to make these different guilds of insects. We're not going to spend a lot of time about how to make aquatic insects at home, because for most people that's just not practical. Unless you have a river or a stream or a lake in your yard, it's very tough to do. Now, a lot of people do put in water features, as you see here. But one of the things we like to do with our water features is keep them crystal clear. If a leaf falls in, we make sure that leaf comes out of there. And of course, the leaf is the energy that runs those systems. If you really want to make insects in your yard, this is what you need in your yard. But it's going to be a hard sell to move this into our neighborhoods. So now, how do we make pollinators? Extremely important insects. Let's first talk about what is a pollinator. A pollinator, of course, is an insect or an animal. There are, hummingbirds and other things, bats, that are pollinators. But they're animals that move pollen to the female parts of plants. And if they're not doing that successfully, they really are not pollinators. Most of the insects that visit flowers are not pollinating them. They are flower visitors. And there's a whole bunch that we see all the time. These syrphid flies get a lot of credit for doing a lot of pollination, but actually for most of the flowers they're visiting, they're sucking on the nectar and being happy, but they're not moving very much pollen. That's true for a lot of our butterflies as well. Why do we need pollinators? Well, of course, the standard answer is that pollinators pollinate our crops. They pollinate upwards of 1/3 of the crops that we humans eat. Certainly necessary. We don't want to lose that. But that's a very anthropocentric view of why we need pollinators. I like to look at the bigger picture. There we go, 1/3 of our crops. But pollinators are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants, all angiosperms. So imagine if we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. So you forget our crops. If we lost 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, we would all be doomed for sure. So again, losing our pollinators is simply not an option. We have to make them, and we have to make them everywhere because we need plants everywhere. Who are our major pollinators? Well, we have one species of honeybee introduced from Europe, and it is a very good pollinator of many of the crops that we also introduced from Europe, from the Old World. But of course, before we brought the honeybee over to North America, there were 4,000 species of native bees that did all the pollination, except for what was being done by bats and hummingbirds. And we tend to ignore these native bees. They're excellent pollinators. The downside for most native bees is that they don't fly as far from their homes as honeybees do. So when we make these mega fields for modern agriculture, it's difficult to get native bees to fly to the middle of those and be efficient pollinators. So 4,000 species of native bees. We also have 14,000 species of moths and butterflies. And if you look in the book, it'll say, well, we got about 12,500 species of moths and butterflies. That's because there are a couple thousand that are undescribed, but pretty easily collected. Now these guys are, they're not as good at pollinating as our bees. Although there are plants that are exclusively pollinated by moths. Basswood is one of them. But there are so many of these species, and most of them are crawling over our flowers at night, that they do transfer a lot of pollen. Many plants would miss moths sorely if we were to lose them. So I'm going to throw them into the important basket of pollinators, and we need to conserve them as well. All right, how do we do that? Let's talk about making nesting opportunities for pollinators, for bees, at home. How do we do that? We've got to know where they're nesting. They nest in the ground. There are species that nest in woody stems. They hollow out the center of those stems. And there are a number of species that nest in pithy stems that really don't need to be hollowed out much. We see ground nesters fairly easily in the spring before a lot of vegetation covers up where they're nesting. Some of the first bees that we see are Colides bees. They're solitary bees. So you have a female that digs a hole in the ground, and then she provisions little cells in that hole for individual larvae, but it's not a colony. And that's an important point because it means she's not aggressively defending a colony the way a honeybee would. A lot of people say, I do not want bees in my yard, I don't want to be stung. Well, you're not going to be stung by these native bees because almost all of them are solitary bees and they are not aggressive like those social bees. Another important point is that people tend to think yellow jackets are bees. They're not. They're wasps. They're nasty. And if you want to get rid of your yellow jackets, that's okay by me because they sting me too. So anyway, what you want to do to improve the ground nesting opportunities for your bees, they really like slight south-facing slopes. Of course, your soil has to be loose enough that they can dig in it. If you live in very heavy clay, you're not going to have a lot of ground nesting bees. But most soils are loose enough that the bees can dig into them. So south facing and little patches that have no vegetation on them. You don't have to cut down all the trees in your property to have ground nesting bees, just little patches where you've got some sun exposure. They really enjoy those. How about those pithy stem nesters? So here's a picture depicting a bee that has tunneled into a dead rose stalk. And let's see, I don't know if you can see, I don't know, there you go. Maybe you can see my pointer. This larva over here to the right is the oldest one. This is the youngest one. So the female bee made a cell over here, packed it with pollen. The larval bee is eating that pollen, and this guy's a little bit younger, younger yet. So she has a whole series of little cells that she has provisioned and lays a single egg in each one. And it's all happening within this dead rose stem. So things like old goldenrod stems and hydrangea stems, hydrangea arborescens, native hydrangea is perfect for these pithy stem nesters. That's not very tough, and the bees can get in there. And of course, you can see what happens here when we clean up in the fall and we get rid of all of the blooming plants that were around during the spring, black-eyed Susans, things like that. We're throwing away our native bee pithy stem nesters. That's where they are. They are buried in the stems, and that's how they spend the winter. So if you can leave a section in your yard where these things stand through the winter, or cut them down gently at the base and stack them in a place, you're helping your pithy stem nesters. Woody stem nesters, pretty much the same thing. We have to have opportunities for these guys to tunnel into the wood and make those series of cells. So what they like is weak wood, very soft wood. Things like elderberry that's a wonderful plant for pithy stem nesters. Elderberry doesn't live very long, so you get these dead stems on there, and of course most of us are neatniks and we go out there with our clippers and trim off the dead stems. But what you've done then is trim off the opportunity for one of these wood-boring bees. One thing we've done to compensate for the loss of wood-boring opportunities is to put up bee hotels. We've discovered bee hotels. I'm starting to think bee hotels are a lot more fun for humans than they are for bees. Some people go absolutely crazy making their bee hotels. And of course the bees do use these. These are wood opportunities where we've drilled holes, or we put in bamboo that's already hollow and we stack them up. And bees of different sizes will make their tunnels and provision them. The problem is that research is showing that when you put all your bee wood nesting opportunities in the same place, you're essentially putting all your bees in one basket. And if a predator finds these, or if a disease finds these bee hotels, they're home free. They can just go from cell to cell and have a great old time. So it makes more sense to arrange these bee hotels in much smaller units. So just a few little holes, and scatter them throughout your property. That's the way it would be in a natural setting, so that predators wouldn't be able to find all your bees in one place, and you'll get much higher survivorship that way. So what do bees need to reproduce? Well, of course, they need that pollen, and they need nectar. They also need something that most people don't think about. In honeybees, we call it propolis. It is, well, I'll talk about it in a second. So first, let's talk about pollen and nectar. That's obvious. And they also need pollen and nectar throughout the season. Sam Droege and Jared Fowler was a student, I believe, at one point, works for Xerces at this point, are among the people trying to find out what bees need in order to survive in our built landscapes. So here's a study they did in New England, and they found out that native bee species are active in New England, where it's cold, from March all the way to November. So that is practically all year long. And what are they active doing? They're active going to flowers to get the pollen and nectar that they need to keep their offspring alive. So one of the biggest challenges in keeping our bee populations happy at home is to have a continuous sequence of blooms throughout the year. And some parts of the summer are a little tricky that way. It starts to dry up. You don't have many blooming plants, but you can have native bees in your yard successfully if you go for 3 weeks in July with no blooming plants. They're going to have to go someplace else. So picking your plants carefully is, in terms of the sequence of bloom, is very important. Which species of plants do we need? This could be even more important. Sam Droege is Mr. Bee. He knows everything about native bees. And there's one thing he said, and it's got to be the most important thing he's ever going to say in his life, and that is we need to plant in order to meet the needs of our specialist bees. There are bees that will only gather pollen and nectar, particularly the pollen, from a single genus of plants. They might go to several species in that genus, but they'll focus their specialist on one genus. If we don't plant that genus of plants, we have lost those bees. The generalist bees can go to lots of genera of plants. So you don't have to worry about planting for generalists. They take care of themselves. We need to plant for the specialist. Why do we have bees specializing out there? Because plants are really different from each other. They have different flowering phenology, meaning they're blooming at different times of the year. Each of the flowers look different. They have a different physical structure, different morphology. They smell different from each other. The pollen grains are very different. Pollen grains are species specific. You can identify each species of plant that's out there by the pollen grain if you have access to one of our pollen libraries. And pollen is really different. So is nectar, too, in terms of its nutritional value. It differs in the amount of protein. I think that the range goes from 2% to 90% protein. Some pollen grains are protected with secondary metabolic compounds, defensive compounds, so that only the specialist bees will like that pollen. They have the ability to get around those compounds, and the other bees won't like it. So the different amino acids, starches, sterols, lots of differences between plants. So in order to get good at utilizing particular plants, bees have to specialize. So Sam and Jared have also looked at the number of specialists that we know of on different plant genera in different areas of the country. Here's more data from New England. Solidago is #1, goldenrod, supporting 11 species of specialist bees in New England, followed by willows, support eight more species, asters, 7 more species, blueberries, 5 more species. So with just those 4 genera of plants, goldenrods, willows, and asters, you're supporting a number, 25, 26 species of bees. Here's a similar list from the upper Midwest, where sunflowers jump to the lead. They're supporting 13 species, followed by asters and goldenrods and willows. So you don't need very many genera of plants in your yard to support a lot of specialist bees. And remember, your bumblebees and your honeybees and the other generalists will go to the sunflowers, asters, and goldenrods and willows as well. So what we're trying to do is identify the genera of plants that support the most specialists so people can start to focus on those. And right now, if you want to go buy a book, well, I'll get there. It's a book by Heather Holm that summarizes our current knowledge, and we'll see that in a minute. Here are some examples of specializations. Andrena asteroides needs asters. No asters, you don't have that bee. Spring beauties support Andrena eriginii. So that bee will disappear without our spring beauties. False indigo supports Calides albescens. Here's the book I'm talking about. It's called Bees, an Identification and Native Plant Forage Guide. Again, this is for the upper Midwest and Northeast region. But it gives you a good idea of which bees are specialists and what plants they need. Propolis, what the heck is propolis? That's a term used for honeybees. Honeybees will go to trees mostly. Sometimes it's bushes, but for the most part it's trees, and they will find waxes and resins from these trees, and they mix it all together, and then they line their hive with this stuff that we call propolis. And they're doing that, we're finding out, because propolis has antibiotic activity. It helps to keep the diseases out of these social beehives. Bumblebees do the same thing with a waxy material. It's not called propolis, but what it's doing is going to particular plants out there and essentially gathering up something that acts just like neosporin, and they're slathering it all over the places where they are. The next bit of research is to identify the most important plants that are supplying these bees with these antibiotic resins and waxes. So this is another role for plants in your yard. Very new research here, but we're going to have the woody plants in our yard that provide propolis, or our bees don't have protection from diseases. So stay tuned. A lot of people are working on this to see what those important plants are. Okay. We don't have to reiterate that bees are essential for pollination, and we're not going to have the plants without those bees. But in terms of passing the food the plants produce on to vertebrates, to things like birds, bees are not very important. There are very few birds that eat a lot of bees, and most other things avoid them for obvious reasons. They don't want to get stung. So now let's talk about the insects that are major components of the food webs that keep life on this planet. And it turns out that all the evidence is pointing towards moths. Moths are passing on more energy than any other type of insect. And remember, moths are also important pollinators themselves. So now we have two good reasons to make a lot of moths in our landscapes. And you know what? It's generally not adult moths. It's generally the caterpillars. It's caterpillars that are transferring the most energy from plants to other animals. So let's use bird food webs as an example. It's easy to see what birds are feeding their young if you have a good camera. Well, we know that 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. And what we are learning is that most of those insects are indeed caterpillars. Which means you're not going to have birds where you don't have enough caterpillars, where you don't have those caterpillars transferring the energy the plants have gathered from the sun. So let's ask the question, why caterpillars? What is special about caterpillars that birds are favoring? There are a lot of beetles out there. As a matter of fact, there are more beetle species than there are moths or butterflies. Yet the birds are not focusing on beetles, and most other things aren't as well. Why is that? There are a number of reasons. One has to be that most caterpillars are soft, and if you're a bird, that means you can stuff the caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring the esophagus of your little one. Very practical reason, but I think it's got to be an important one. They're also relatively large. They're bags of food. It takes 200 aphids to equal the biomass of one medium-sized caterpillar. Now birds, some of the smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to find 200 aphids, or do you want to eat one caterpillar and get the same amount of food? Caterpillars are also highly nutritious. They're very high in protein and lipids and fats, and they have a low ratio of chitin to food. In other words, that exoskeleton that is undigestible is just this thin coating around this bag of food in a caterpillar. Whereas in a beetle, so much of the beetle is very, very tough exoskeleton that is not going to provide any nutrition. And it's turning out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds when they are breeding. Why do we care about carotenoids? What is a carotenoid? Well, that compound is a carotenoid, and it turns out that only plants make carotenoids. We vertebrates do not make them, yet we vertebrates absolutely need them. Carotenoids are essential components of our diets. And that is why my wife Cindy tells me I have to eat my carrots to get my beta carotene. I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I eat all that stuff because they stimulate my immune system. If I have access to a lot of carotenoids, I am generally healthier. They are antioxidants that run around our bodies and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. Very important contribution to our health. They improve our color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, it turns out she was right. She didn't know she was right, but she was right. They improve sperm vitality. Who doesn't need that? Improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about the birds, like this male prothonotary warbler. He is bright yellow because he had access to lots of luteins. And of course, the brighter he is, the more ladies he's going to attract. What he's doing is taking the pigments from those carotenoids and putting them directly into his feathers. Well, remember, birds can't make their own carotenoids, so they have to get them from plants, but they're not eating plants when they're reproducing, so they have to get them indirectly from plants. And the way they do that is by eating insects. But this is the key here. Caterpillars have twice as many carotenoids as other types of insects, and 3 times as many carotenoids as spiders. And we know birds eat a lot of spiders. They're important components of bird food webs. So now this study was done in Europe. We're repeating it right now in my lab, but if it holds true, it would mean that for most birds, caterpillars are not optional, at least not when they're breeding. It's a very important time in their life history. Which means they're essential. They've got to have caterpillars if they're going to rear healthy young. How many caterpillars do they have to have? Well, many of you have heard me tell the story about chickadees. Carolina chickadee. It takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make 1 clutch of Carolina chickadees. Tiny birds, 1/3 of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth. And that's just to get them to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. The parents then feed the fledglings caterpillars for another 30 days, and nobody's counted them. So you're talking about a lot of caterpillars to keep healthy bird populations around. Well, where are we going to get all these caterpillars? How do we make that many caterpillars? Let's first talk about how not to make caterpillars. And of course, you're looking at how not to make them. When we consider plants to be just decorations, and when we want to make our landscapes look like Gone with the Wind here, we're taking an area, I don't know how many acres that is, that used to have thousands and thousands of species on it, replacing it with lawn, and now the life that was on that property is indeed gone with the wind. There are very few species in that short grass there. Why do we worship lawn? Look, we're still giving Lawn of the Month awards here. Somebody sent me this from St. Louis, I believe. So this family has received an award for creating the deadest landscape in the neighborhood. This is a lot of our, we have an area in lawn in North America the size of New England at this point. We've got to get past that if we're going to keep functioning ecosystems at home, because this isn't doing any of the things we need to do. How do we put caterpillars into these types of landscapes? Well, we do that by putting the plants that these caterpillars eat into the landscapes. And they have to be very specific plants, because 90% of them, 90% of all the insects, in fact, that eat plants are just like the special species. They can only develop and reproduce on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. We call them host plant specialists. Plants are protecting their tissues with nasty tasting compounds, and most insects cannot eat those plants until they develop the adaptations, the enzymes and the behavioral adaptations and the life history adaptations that allow them to eat those plants without dying. But it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for these adaptations to fall into place. And what that means is, once you develop all the adaptations that allow you to eat one plant lineage, you haven't developed them to eat other plant lineages. So now you can specialize only, or you can only eat the one plant on which you've been specializing on. So point is, plant choice matters. If I want to have the Pandora Sphinx, the beautiful Pandora Sphinx in my yard, I've got to have Virginia creeper, because that is the host plant on which it has specialized. Now, if I have Virginia creeper, I get lots of other caterpillars. I get the Abbott Sphinx, I get the Virginia creeper Sphinx, I get others. If I want the beautiful tulip tree silk moth, and I do, then I eat tulip trees. But if I have tulip trees, I also get the tulip tree beauty and others. Luna moths, at least where I live, are specialists on sweet gum. And if I have sweet gum, I get the large pectes, and on we go. The pawpaw sphinx is only going to be in my yard if I have pawpaw, but if I have pawpaw, I get the beautiful zebra swallowtail. That, in fact, is why I planted pawpaw in my yard. I wanted to get this beautiful butterfly. If we have native grapes, we get the 8-spotted forester moth. We get lots of things. We get the pearly wood nymph, the beautiful wood nymph, the greater grapevine looper, and many others. Our native viburnums are going to give us the green marvel, the horrid zale, the hummingbird sphinx, the rose hooktip moth, all beautiful moths. Goldenrod is a very powerful plant. Give us the Arcigera flower moth, the brown hooded owlet, the beautiful Utilia, and that is its name. It's only going to be in our yard if we have poison ivy. And yes, I can hear everybody groaning. It is a specialist on poison ivy, but look, we also get the eyed pectes if we have poison ivy. We also make poison ivy berries that the birds love in the fall because they are loaded with fat. If we have persimmon, we can have the small necklace moth and the sculptured moth. Black gum will give us the Hebrew and the false underwing. Ash gives us lots of things. The wave sphinx, the fawn sphinx, I think that's just gorgeous. I call that art in the garden. Maples give us the rosy maple moth, the large maple spanworm, the bantam maple dagger moth, and many others. This is the most spectacular caterpillar in the country, the hickory horned devil. It's in trouble. It's already disappeared from New England. Well, it's a specialist on walnut and hickory. The adult is the royal walnut moth, one of our prettiest and largest moths. Double-toothed prominent is a specialist on elm, and its crazy-looking larva looks like a dinosaur. Also the elm sphinx with elm, the interrupted dagger moth, the orange-headed epicalema. If you have witch hazel, you can have the witch hazel dagger moth and the mustard sallow. Pine will give you the imperial moth and the eastern panthea. Native clematis will give us the spotted thyrus. Greenbrier, give us this crazy-looking curved line outlet. Blueberry, the Drexel's Daytana. Buttonbush, the lost owlet. Native willows will give us the herald. Coral honeysuckle, the snowberry clearwing. Evening primrose, the gorgeous evening primrose moth. The showy emerald is only going to be on sumac. And I'm not asking you to plant poison sumac here. Poison sumac is a plant of the swamps. I've never even seen it. I'm talking about smooth sumac or staghorn sumac or winged sumac. These are very good soil stabilizers, wonderful native plants. So that what looks like as a dead leaf is actually the caterpillar of the showy emerald. Ditch daisy or Biden's aristosa will give us the goldenrod stowaway. Ferns don't produce too many caterpillars, but they do make the shaded fern moth, particularly New York fern. Dodder gives us obtuse yellow. Got a lot of things on black cherry. The lemon plagotes, the crazy looking white furcula, crocus geometer, the Io moth, colorful zale, wonderful cecropia moth. You know, if you want to get your kids interested in nature, there's no better way than to show them a cecropia moth. As a matter of fact, you can send them on a scavenger hunt in the yard if you have the proper host plants, because there'll be some stage of the cecropia moth in the yard all year long. The adult doesn't live very long. The eggs are there for about 6 days on that black cherry. The larva's there almost a month, developing a new big sausage-like larva. But then the cocoon is there the rest of the summer and all winter long. Fun to look for those cocoons. You also get the tufted bird dropping moth on maple, the crazy paddle dagger moth. You can ask your kids what those paddles are for, get them to think about that. Or what are these filaments for, and the filament geometer that's also on cherry. Cherry shoot borer is beautiful. The crazy Harris's 3-spot that holds its shed head capsules like an umbrella over its head. Oaks, of course, are supporting more than anything else. The hag moth that looks like a tarantula. The red-wash prominent looks like the Pillsbury doughboy. White dotted prominent, the spiny oak caterpillar, the skiff moth, the white blotched heterocampa, the oak skeletonizer, the beautiful polyphemus moth caterpillar, the half-oval ancillus, barred white tineids, actually very specialized on oak. They only eat a fungus that grows in the crevices of oak bark, but you won't have them without oak. This is my favorite, the spun glass slug caterpillar, puss caterpillar, and literally hundreds more. Okay, why did I drag you through all of those caterpillars? The point here is that I took all of those pictures that you just saw at my house, and this is what my house looked like. Well, it's 17 years ago now, but this area was mowed for hay. So that's what it looked like then. This is what it looks like now. And the reason we have all of those caterpillars passing on all of that energy is because we planted witch hazels and oaks and persimmons and American elm and red maple, white and green ash, ditch daisy, viburnum, dentatum, black gum and buttonbush, coral, honeysuckle, pawpaw, sweet gum, clematis, blueberries, white pine. Equally important, we tolerated black cherry. Most people pull it out, oh, it's a weed, got to get rid of it. We tolerated New York fern and grapes and tulip trees and Virginia creeper and goldenrod. All these things came in on their own. Winged sumac, evening primrose, black willow, poison ivy. You know when you get poison ivy? When you try to get rid of it, just ignore it. Greenbrier, black walnut, dodder, all these things we tolerated and has given us a very living landscape. And of course, because we have so much of this life at home, we now have the birds that eat these guys. We have wood thrush eating the lettered sphinx because we have Virginia creeper making the lettered sphinx. We have indigo bunnings eating ruby quakers because we have alder that makes ruby quakers. We have the gray-edged bomoloca. I mean, yeah, we have the gray-edged bomoloca because we have black wallet, but look who's eating it. It's the chipping sparrow feeding her young. Field sparrow feeding the red-lined panapoda to its baby because we have oaks. And of course our friends, the Carolina chickadee, bringing dowdy pinions back to their nest because we've got black cherry making those dowdy pinions. Spicebush swallowtail is there to feed the white-eyed vireo because we've got spicebush. The wrens are feeding copper underwings to their babies because we've got hickories. And our bluebirds are feeding drab prominence to their offspring because we've got sycamores. You might wonder whether all these caterpillars are going to defoliate all of our trees. No, they're not. This is an oak tree. It's 14 years old, planted it from an acorn in my yard. I counted all of the caterpillars just at head height on the lower branches of this oak tree in 2014. One day, one afternoon, 410 caterpillars right here. But you can't see any of those caterpillars and you can't see any of the damage they're forming. I met a woman named Tammany Baumgarten in New Orleans a few months ago, and she suggested that we practice the 10-step program with our trees. We should take 10 steps backwards from those trees and all of our insect problems disappear. It's exactly what's happened with this picture. This is the distance at which we view our trees, and you can't see any insect problems. So which plants should we plant? Be sure to have in our landscapes. Well, we make lists in my lab. This is a list ranking all of the woody plant genera in the mid-Atlantic states. It turned out to be a popular list because people realize they can focus on this left part of the list here and create the numbers at the end after each plant genus of the number of species of caterpillars that are recorded in the literature on these plants. So if you plant these guys, you get the most caterpillars, then you get the most birds. You can find a list which is tailored to your county On the National Wildlife Federation website, go to Native Plant Finder. That's what the URL is, but you can find it with Native Plant Finder. Plug in your zip code and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants for your county will pop up. Very powerful tool. One thing I saw once we made this list for every county and every state of the union was that some plants were much more powerful than others in creating the food that drives these food webs. So I started calling them foraging hubs. I took the idea by looking at a Delta magazine. Once I was on a Delta plane not going anywhere, looking at the magazine, and these of course are the Delta hubs. I said, that's exactly what I'm talking about with foraging hubs. Let's make them foraging hubs. There you go. Now each line going into this oak tree right here could be a bird or it could be a species of bird. It could be a lizard. It's going into this tree because the tree is making lots of food. These other black dots in this landscape are other plant species, and there are lines going into them, but not very many, because those plants are not making very much food. So imagine what would happen if we lost these really important genera, keystone genera, foraging hubs, whatever you want to call them. You'd have a failed food web because these other plants aren't making enough food. And it turns out that just 5% of the available plant genera in your area is making 73 to 75% of the food. That means you could build a landscape using 95% of the available plant genera and only make 25 or 27% of the food. That's a failed food web. You've got to include these really powerful plants, and you will find them on that list. Here's a little bit of data from my PhD student, Desiree Narango, who's working with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. She's looking at 93 pairs of Carolina chickadees, looking at how successful they are in breeding compared to the landscape in which they're breeding in. So this is one pair, that's where the nest is. The blue areas represent where they did 95% of their foraging within this territory. So they were foraging on the native trees in that territory, the basswood, sweet gum, American elm, black cherry, pin oaks, willow oaks. Let's look at what they were not foraging on, and that's all the trees from Asia, our Japanese maples and ginkgo and black poplar, crepe myrtles, silk tree, saucer magnolia. And it's very easy to picture a landscape that is filled with these Asian trees that are not producing enough food to keep these chickadees alive. And when that happens, this happens. This is a failed nest. There were 3 dead chickadee chicks in there. Desiree noticed that it was filled with sunflower seeds, and what she thinks happened is the parents simply ran out of caterpillars. Somebody had a bird feeder up. So the parents tried to feed the young sunflower seeds, but they can't eat them. They can only eat caterpillars, so they all starved to death. Here's the summation of her work. This is replacement lice. We're looking at the population growth of chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. If the chickadees are replacing themselves each year, that's replacement. That's a sustainable population. But if they're not, and that's what's happening down here, they're not making as many chickadees as they had the year before. And look what's happening. As soon as you start adding non-native plants to the landscape, here's 25% non-native, 50% non-native, you drop way below replacement weight in population growth. So there are real consequences. What we've done with our suburban neighborhoods, the way we landscape them with Asian plants, is to create ecological sinks. We call in these birds to try to reproduce, and then they fail. How we plant these trees is very important for moth survival. There are 511 species of caterpillars developing on oaks in Pennsylvania. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, will spin a cocoon and spend the winter or its cocoon stage on the tree itself. But most of them go off the tree. 94%, 480 species, pupate in the soil beneath the tree or in a cocoon in the leaf litter beneath the tree. So what we have beneath the tree turns out to be really important. This is a dead zone for caterpillars. They might produce, form themselves up here in the leaves, but when they fall down here, this is all hard packed soil. They can't tunnel into that. There's no leaf litter for them to bury in. And this is even worse with our cement happy urban landscapes. This is what you need. Put a nice native azalea under a tulip tree here, some ferns and all these other plants. Then your caterpillars will be able to do well. This is the place to do your spring ephemeral gardening. You don't know you're helping caterpillars, but you really are. Any of the native ground covers like mayapple or native pachysandra. You don't need the Asian pachysandra. Foam flower, countless species would make an excellent habitat for these moths. So if our yards look like this, we really could improve moth survival, we could improve bee survival, pollinator survival. Energy would flow through our ecosystem so much better than it does now. All right, I want to end by returning to E.O. Wilson. He's an extremely prolific guy. He writes about 1 book a year. He's now about 85, but he's still doing it. His latest book is called Half Earth. He's not out to win the Pulitzer Prize anymore. He's not mincing any words. He's getting right to it. He says, if we are going to save life on Earth, we have to save half of the Earth. We have to preserve ecosystem function in half of the planet. So if you think about that, in order to realize E.O.'s dream, we're going to need a new approach to conservation. Remember, half of the terrestrial planet is already in agriculture, and we're in the other half. So in addition to saving biodiversity where there are no humans, that's the traditional form of conservation, we now have to save it where humans abound. It's a new way to do it, but that means you've got to work on your property at home. So this approach empowers each one of us. Each one of us now can play a vital role in our local conservation. The object is to make our yard a contributing part of our local ecosystem, not something that's going to detract from it. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live if you think about these things. We can do this. I am convinced we can do this, but we're all going to need to work together to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. What a wonderful presentation. I've heard you speak about 5 times now, and each time I learned so much more. And I'm wondering if folks in the audience have questions. I have one question here from a listener who says, I believe yellow jackets are pollinators and important to clean up dead insects. And she asked if you could comment on that. You mentioned yellow jackets earlier.
Right. Yellow jackets are predators. Now they like to crawl in our Coke can and get sugar. There are some wasps, paper wasps and things that spend some time on flowers. But they're not important pollinators. They're not moving pollen around. Most of the time they're hunting for insects on those plants, and most of the time they're not going for dead insects. They want living ones, so they love caterpillars. They will grab a caterpillar, they'll chop it in pieces and fly off with usually the thorax. So I'm not saying get rid of all your yellow jackets, but I do react to people that say I don't want any bees in my yard when they're really worried about yellow jackets. Yellow jackets are protecting their nests, and they can be aggressive. They can nest in the ground, or they're aerial yellow jackets, and if you have an active nest next to your sidewalk or something, it's very difficult to walk by it without getting stung. I just don't want our native bees being blamed for that.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. All right, another question. How does home irrigation affect nectar quality production? For example, does more water dilute its quality? Or is there less increase or no impact?
Yeah, good question. That depends on what the plant really wants. There is no doubt that when we have a very rainy season, the sugar content of nectar goes down. So if you create an artificial load of water in your yard by watering all the time, you may be lowering the sugar content. At the same time, you've got to keep your plants happy. 2 or 3, maybe 3 years ago, there was a terrible drought, particularly in Texas, and the flowering plants in the greater landscape of particularly East Texas, they were gone. I mean, there was nothing flowering. And the only flowers that were out there for migrating monarchs and the native bees were flowers in people's gardens. So that was a perfect example of the fact that people were artificially watering these artificial landscapes, but they served a vital role in getting those monarchs through to Mexico and keeping our native bees around. So watering in proper amounts can be very important.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Another question is it possible to get the kind of information about the woody species that you shared for the East in the Mid-Atlantic? Can you get the same kind of information for the Northwest, say?
You mean about the specialist bees?
Yeah, about the species that supported more insects.
You can get the lists I was talking about for every county in the country. So you just put in your zip code no matter where you live, and the appropriate list for the Pacific Northwest or wherever you are will come up. As far as getting lists of the best plants for specialist pollinators, we have to wait for Sam to publish more papers on that. He does have one for the Mid-Atlantic that I have to get up and active. He's working on the Southeast now. But this is very, you know, the recognition that we have to save our pollinators has jumped ahead of the science. All of a sudden, Obama said, here, let's fund this, and we didn't even know what plants to get out there. So everybody's scrambling, but we are learning things every single day.
And so they can go to the National Wildlife Federation and put in their zip code on that native plant finder. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Great. Another question, do you have a chart of moths and their host plants? And I've gone to that finder and I tried to create a chart, but I wasn't able to manipulate it that way. Was I just not in the loop on how to do it?
Boy, I don't know when you went. You know, we had a web designer quit over this. It was such a massive data set. And we have a new web designer. This is still in beta testing, and they tell me, I have not been there lately, but they tell me it works pretty well now. Can it print out a chart for your area? I think that's a goal for the future. So you probably just have to click through and make your own chart. But I will tell you that there's a similar website on the Audubon website called something like Planting for Birds, and that will print out a chart of the best plants. The only problem with that is that's based off my Mid-Atlantic list, and if you live in the Mid-Atlantic, that's great, but if you don't, it's not going to be as accurate as the National Wildlife Federation website. But I think it does email you a list of plants. That's a very nice feature of that.
Okay. Another question, well, I think this is sort of getting to the same thing. Do you have an analogous plant genus recommendation for California? But I think you just answered that.
Right, native plant finder.
Right, yeah. Okay, I'm trying to get everybody's question answered. Here we go. Here's another one. What are the most critical concepts to teach to students about moths and butterflies, ecological role in the national park context?
Well, there's a lot of critical things we need to teach our kids, the general public. You know, these moths are not worms. They're not something we should squish all the time. You know, a woman said I planted milkweeds to help the monarch, but worms got on them, so I squished them. We have to recognize the different stages of insects. Those worms, of course, are the monarch caterpillars. In terms of the national park idea, I want to cut the area of lawn in half and create what I'm going to call homegrown national park. We're gonna make biodiversity right where we are. We won't have to go to Yellowstone in order to see it, but we have to get people to recognize that we all need it, that this is essential, that plants are more than decorations, and mostly that their piece of the world is an important component of their local ecosystem. And they can contribute to that ecosystem or they can detract from it. And right now, most people detract from it. This is it's an exciting message to a lot of people because they can see the results and it makes them feel like they can do something. You know, we've got so many really critical environmental issues. Global warming, you can stop driving your SUV, but can you go out and actually see the difference? Unfortunately, no, you can't. But if you put some powerful plants in your yard, you can see the difference. It's positive feedback that motivates you to do it again. So we have to change the culture to make it culturally acceptable to do this. That's the hardest thing.
Right. Well, and you've contributed so much to that, Doug, and we appreciate how you continue to crisscross the country spreading this message. Another question is, this is an amazing presentation, and they ask, have you or do you plan to make this presentation to Congress?
I believe you need to be invited to do that. If I am, I will happily make it to Congress. But I think their attention span is about 5 minutes, so I'd have to shorten it a bit.
And then that same person said, what about sharing it through our cooperative extension service? Maybe they would have educational funds to support the effort.
Well, you said you're taping it, right, Phyllis? So
that's right. Yeah.
How do people get access to it?
Yeah, we're going to send out the link after this is done. Exactly.
Okay.
All right. Let's see if there's any last questions. I think that might be all the questions. I'm making sure. Okay. Doug, I think you answered every single question, which is just amazing.
Good.
And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else did. And I look forward to sharing the recording. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Doug. And thank you, UNC Asheville, for helping me with some of the technical issues today. So long, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.